evangelist. I knew Kenny when he was down in Tampa, but only vaguely. He was the basketball coach there at FC, as I'm sure most of you know. He taught a number of the different PE classes that we were required to take, and so I think I took one class with him, and that's about all the time I really got to spend with him. He preached there at university, I believe it was, but I didn't really end up attending there too often. Um, and then I knew that where mom and dad lived at the time in Mayfield, Kentucky, they would have him up for meetings every couple of years, and always just raved about how well he taught the Bible, and I never really had gotten to hear that. And then just a couple of years ago, when he was moving here, he had a meeting up in Owensboro, Kentucky, where my mom and dad are now, and he was preaching that meeting there for them. And I got to hear him speak and spend some more time with him, and it's just been really nice to get to be in the kind of general same area with someone like him. He just does a really good job. I know you all, or at least I sure hope you do, view yourselves as fortunate to get to have a Christian of his caliber with you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to get to be here for the VBS. We're going to start studying 2nd and 3rd John for this hour, and then in the final hour we will study Jude. As far as this hour goes, I can promise you that we will study 2nd John. If time allows, we will move into 3rd John. I hope that it does, but by the time I got done with this particular manuscript, it was far longer than I think the time was going to permit, so we'll see how we can do. As we're beginning to look at 2nd and 3rd John, I do want us to quickly get our bearings in the New Testament timeline. It's very important to appreciate where these epistles fall relative to some other New Testament events. For starters, of course, you've got Jesus' crucifixion and the events of Acts 2 that happen around either AD 30 or AD 33, somewhere in that general area. You then have Paul's journeys and his letters that are written from the late 40s into the early 60s. Then Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts. You've got those three synoptic gospels, and then the book of Acts that Luke also wrote. Those were likely written somewhere around the early 60s. Matthew may have been written earlier. But by AD 70, most of the New Testament books have already been written. And then in AD 70, you have the judgment upon Jerusalem. Jerusalem falls to the Romans, as Jesus had said it would. And then John the Apostle moves to the Roman province of Asia at some point. And somewhere during the last few decades of the 1st century, he writes the Gospel of John and the three epistles that we know as 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. At this period of time when John is writing his gospel and his epistles, most, if not all, of the apostles have already died. And so we can basically think of John as the last of the apostles. He was indeed. And these letters come from the latter part of the time when the books of the New Testament were being written. And so as John writes his epistles, even his gospel, it's been a long time since Christ lived and died and established the church. And so let's keep that in mind as we're turning now to 2nd John. I'd like for us to just go ahead and read this, and then we'll begin to discuss it. It's so short, we're only going to need 2 volunteers to read this. If someone would read, please, verses 1 through 6, and then someone else, verses 7 through 13. 1 through 6, anybody? Okay, so we took just the first few seconds to discuss the place of the epistles of John in the New Testament timeline. And I wanted to do so that we can now be thinking of this epistle as being written by John at some point when he is dealing with the Christians there in the Roman province of Asia, around the vicinity of Ephesus. John worked in that region some, and before John even came to work with the Christians at Ephesus, who was there a number of years before him? Paul was, about 20 or 30 years before. Paul, on his third missionary journey, had been in that region. But now the first century is coming to a close, and John is in that area, and for some reason he's writing these epistles. We don't really know what it is that motivates him to do so beyond what is mentioned in these brief letters. We can look at his concerns, we can see what issues earn his focus, but that's about all we know. And so we've got to look closely at this epistle and ask, why was it written? And when we do, I believe we find that the reason John writes this letter is in fact a familiar one. False teachers have arrived. And these false teachers in particular are teaching that Jesus did not in fact come in the flesh. John's very concerned about that, and he's quite insistent that the brethren to which he writes do not receive those individuals. He says, you've got these dangerous teachers there who deny that Jesus came in the flesh, and you need to have nothing to do with them. He's talking about the fact that not only do they deny that Jesus came in the flesh, but also they de-emphasize the importance of love. But all of that springs from their insistence that Jesus did not come in the flesh. He says they're very unloving, they're very contentious people, and they're a tremendous danger that threatens to corrupt the church to which John is writing. Verse 8, watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Verse 10, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. We're going to talk about what all he means by that when we get to it, but that's why this was written. It's because John has reason to believe that these false teachers are there in the area where this congregation is, and he doesn't want the congregation, either unwittingly or intentionally, to receive these people and allow these false teachers to find a forum among them. So let's start to go through this, and let's analyze this letter. In verse 1, give me just a moment, I'm going to try to move this down a bit. Keep hitting it. Verse 1. The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth. So the author of this letter identifies himself as the elder, and in fact the author of what we call 3 John does the very same, the elder. And I'll just say very briefly, as you may have noticed, nowhere in this letter, and in fact nowhere in 3 John, does John explicitly identify himself. Never actually mentions his name. As John typically does in his gospel, he identifies himself here very vaguely. What's the nickname that John uses for himself in his gospel? You remember? The disciple whom Jesus loved. That's his preferred moniker for himself. He doesn't usually state his own name. He doesn't state his name in this epistle. But most students of the matter, that is to say, most anybody who's looked into the matter of who it is that wrote this epistle, are agreed that the historical evidence, among other things, very strongly supports John's authorship. And for the sake of our study, and also because I agree, we're just going to leave it at that. So John refers to himself as the elder, and obviously he expects his audience, the recipients of this letter, to know who he is. Now there's a couple of reasons why he might use that kind of a designation, right? The elder. For starters, John is literally an elder among men. We don't know precisely when he writes these epistles. As I say, it's very likely in the last couple of decades of the first century. But John is certainly advanced in years as he does so. And so it's possible that this was a nickname for him, indeed a term of affection, a term of endearment, the old man. Now we wouldn't use that as a nickname for anybody. I don't know anyone who has ever gone by the term of the old man. About the only thing we have is a child disrespectfully calling their father my old man. We don't appreciate that kind of a moniker, but I hope we can see how they might have. This is the elder. This is the old man, and they cherished him for his age, for his wisdom, for his experiences. But then also, this may have just been a term that an apostle would use for themselves. The Greek word that's translated elder, it could of course be an adjective that just meant older. It could also be used as a noun to refer to an older man. Or it could also refer to someone who, is a leader among the people. And I think it's kind of easy for us to understand how those ideas might become attached, that the word for elder came to also signify the concept of a leader in the community. In the Old Testament, you often read about a group of leaders of a various community, and they are who? They're the elders, right? When we looked at Ezekiel on Sunday night, we looked at one particular instance where Ezekiel is there in his house. He's bound, and he's going to proclaim the words of God that God has given to him. And the elders of Judah have come in and sat before him. And so you read all throughout the Old Testament, all the time, where the elders are the leaders of the city. And so even though we're kind of used to seeing the word elder and thinking kind of secondarily somebody who is older, but primarily we think overseer of a local church. Even though we're used to that, that's not the only usage of the term that we find in the New Testament. It's a term with a handful of uses, and it's just important to keep that in mind. What you see in the New Testament is that sometimes the apostles will refer to themselves as elders. And I don't believe they're doing so in the sense of calling themselves overseers of the local church. They're referring to themselves as leaders. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verses 1 and following, Peter the apostle refers to himself as an elder in the sense of a leader. He's in the process of exhorting the actual overseers of a local church, the elders in that sense, who are the leaders of that local church. And he refers to himself as a fellow elder because as an apostle of Jesus Christ, he was most certainly a leader. And so he's telling them that he understands what the leadership position means as he's exhorting them from one leader among the church to other leaders in the church. When you look at some of the second century literature from Christians, that would be things written just after the time of these epistles of John. When you look at things written by Christians from that time, you find that the 12 apostles and Paul were commonly referred to by later Christians as the elders. That was their phrase for them, the leaders. And it's not in the sense of them all being local church shepherds. It's the fact that the apostles were the leaders. They were the ones that Jesus had appointed. They were appointed by Christ as ambassadors to teach the gospel. And so I think you can see how it really wouldn't be strange at all for John to use that term to refer to himself. He is an apostle, but he is also an older man, and he is a leader among the church. What is more, the fact that the apostles would come to be known by Christians as the elders, I believe shows that they were regarded for the fact that they were older in the faith than anyone. They were there when Christ was alive. They were right there with him. And this teaching that's now going out, that John the elder, the one who was with Jesus when he was walking the earth, is warning against, claims that Jesus did not walk the earth in the flesh. Well, John the elder was there when he did precisely that. Also, you have this inclusion of the definite article, the elder. What does that indicate is likely the case that we mentioned already, is the reality when John writes these letters? Sorry. He's the only one left. He is the elder. And so of all the apostles, he's the last one. He's now the elder. There aren't any more of them. So he says the elder, and then he identifies who the recipients are. The elder to the elect lady and her children. I think some of your versions may say chosen lady, or something like that. So as we're coming across that, the elect lady and her children, you might first of all think, and some would suggest, that he's referring to a Christian woman, to some Christian woman who has children. And then when you look at the very last verse, he says, the children of your elect sister greet you. So that's perhaps a little bit strange. What's going on here? Do we have a lady and her kids, and then another lady and her kids, and John knows them both, and he's writing this one, and he wants to convey greetings from the other one? Is that what's taking place here? Or is there another way that you could take that? Most suggest, and for my part, I entirely agree, that what John is doing here is using that terminology to refer to, can anybody guess it? A congregation. Now, maybe that seems a little bit odd to us. Maybe it doesn't at all. That he would refer to a local church as a lady and her children. But I want to keep this out of a modern day mindset, and I want to put it back into an ancient context where this letter comes from. That kind of metaphor, if it seems a little bit odd to us, was actually used all the time by John's contemporaries, namely if they were wanting to refer to, for example, a city and its citizens. The city would be referred to as a woman, as the mother, and then the inhabitants of the city would be referred to as her children. And I think that's what he's doing here. He's writing to a local congregation in one of the cities, likely in that Roman province of Asia, perhaps Ephesus, maybe another city, and writing to the members there, the elect lady and her children. Now you'll notice he refers to as the chosen lady, the elect lady. Paul uses that terminology sometimes. When he talks about Christians being God's elect, it's God who called us. It's his call to which we've responded. And then in the very last verse, what he says is that the children of your elect sister greet you. Well, what would that simply be referring to? Another church. You've got that all the time at the end of epistles, right? Wherever the author is currently residing, as he's writing to the congregation that he is, those Christians there want to send their greetings to the congregation that he's addressing. And so the church where John is sending its greetings to the church that John is writing. And we see that all the time throughout the New Testament. In verse 4, John says, I rejoiced greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. So it would seem that some of the members from that congregation have somehow come into contact with John. Might have been where he was, or maybe on his recent trip there, or whatever. But he's commending them for walking in the truth, these members of this congregation that he's come into contact with, which would indicate that the congregation they represent is likely also walking in the truth too. And so when John ran into some of the members of the congregation, they were walking in the truth, and that speaks well to the group to which they belong. And so maybe it is that this letter is addressed to an individual woman, but I think it makes much more sense to see the letter as addressed to a congregation that he just doesn't name. And as I say, that kind of figure was as common as could be, really, in the ancient world, to refer to citizens in a city or some other group and its members. That's a familiar kind of idiom. And there are, in fact, a few other places in the New Testament where we see something similar as well. But for the sake of time, we won't turn to them. Any questions or comments up to that point? Okay. So he says here, the elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. So if you know the truth of God, whom do you love? Everyone else who does, right? You love every other Christian, every other person in the family of God who perhaps you have never met. You may have only heard of them, but they are in Jesus Christ as you are. They know the truth of God along with you, and so you love them. But you'll notice also that right off the bat, he's emphasizing the truth and its staying power. And that's why he's writing this, as he's going to say in just a moment, there are some deceivers out there who are teaching something that's contrary to the original teaching of Jesus Christ. It's not the truth that was from the beginning and abides forever. It's different. And so he starts out by applauding the truth. And all of that comes there in the opening statements. We haven't even reached the body of the letter, and he's already doing, well, honestly, what you see Paul do a lot. He shapes his greetings with terminology that kind of foreshadows where he's going. And John does that. As a matter of fact, 2 John and even 3 John, they're very Pauline in their characteristics, and maybe you'll notice that. You see a lot of stuff you're familiar with already because of the things that Paul likes to do. So verse 3, you have his salutation. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ the Father's Son. And then look at his emphasis again, in truth and love. So you've got a pretty extensive salutation, but you notice that he's already repeating some of these concepts he's just introduced, and that he's going to focus on truth and love. Then you come down and you get the customary thanksgiving that a letter would typically have right at the start. In verse 4, and we already considered this, he says, I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. Now, I said this is a thanksgiving. He doesn't actually use the word thanks or thanksgiving, but you can certainly see what he is thankful for. John expresses how pleased he is to see the lingering faith of some of the children of this chosen lady. And again, he mentions truth once more. So then with all of that said, you come into verse 5 and you've reached the body of the letter. He says, and now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. So the commandment for Christians to love each other, John says, that's not new. That's what we've had from the beginning. It's nothing recent. You've had 50 to 70 years take place since Jesus was alive, and Jesus had said, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love each other. And then, truthfully, love has always been what God has wanted from his people. And so, this commandment to love isn't anything new. 2 John 6 says, this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. If you're familiar with 1 John and the Gospel of John, that's a very pronounced theme in both of them. In John 14, Jesus is recorded as saying, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. He says, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And says a little further down, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words. And so John says here in 2 John verse 6, right in the middle of the verse, this is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. And then right next to that, he says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Now, if we had studied 1 John before coming to 2 John, then what we've just read would be familiar territory to us. John uses the term deceiver and Antichrist, and as you may be familiar, some like to take that term Antichrist and teach that it's talking about a specific figure, and even now we're still waiting for that person, that profoundly evil person, to come onto the scene. And the Antichrist has had their identity attached to Stalin, to Hitler, to all sorts. I think George Bush even. All sorts of different people have been claimed to be the Antichrist. I'm sure somebody has said Obama is too. Right before Jesus returns is the idea. There's going to be some person who is just unmatched in all of history for their devotion to evil. And so when Christ returns, it will be Christ versus the Antichrist. The term Antichrist, as you can probably deduce, even from what John says here and how he says it, without even having gone through 1 John, where this is discussed in greater depth, is the term that simply means somebody who is anti-Christ. Somebody who is against Christ. And Jesus himself had warned his apostles that there were going to be a number of false messiahs and false prophets who are going to come and they're going to oppose me and what I've taught. And that's what John is saying. You have deceivers and antichrists who are starting to manifest themselves. especially now that most of the apostles have died out. They oppose the truth about Jesus Christ, and they are not for him as they claim. They are against him. They are anti-Christ. And specifically, the way that these false teachers were denying the truth about Jesus is that they claimed Jesus did not come in the flesh. And so the Christ didn't really come as a true flesh and blood human being. And I'm not entirely sure exactly what form this teaching took or what end it served. But we do know that Greek philosophy, the background of so many of these people, it couldn't get itself wrapped around the idea of God becoming man. That just did not fit in to the worldview of anybody who was familiar with Greek philosophy. And so it seems possible that as the gospel is making its way into the Greek corners of the world, and all these years later, people are now trying to deconstruct and rebuild the truth into something that's more compatible with the Greek way of thinking. We know that there are some who taught that Jesus was just an apparition, that he didn't really die on the cross. And then there are others who taught that he was just a regular human being until the Spirit of the Messiah came upon him at his baptism. But before he died on the cross, the Spirit of the Christ left him. So one way or the other, these false teachers are denying that Jesus actually came and died on the cross and then was resurrected. That's a serious issue. But then you've got this dual focus here in 2 John on the commandment to love, as well as the fact that Jesus was incarnated in flesh and blood. How do those two relate to each other? What is it that connects them? I will tell you, I am not sure I understand all of this, but I do have this suggestion for you. The ultimate demonstration of what love is the Son of God willingly going to the cross. To have deity become man and then die for all of those people who don't deserve it, that's the ultimate display of what love is. And if your doctrine denies the incarnation and it denies that the Son of God really did die on the cross, then your concept of love is not all that it should be. Now, I will tell you that explanation, it doesn't really button this up as neatly as I would like. I think there's also a component that these are just selfish, mean people. But that's about the best that I can personally come up with. It's about the best that I found in trying to study any suggested answer. Anybody have a better take on that? It's very likely one exists. Well, somehow, one way or the other, these two doctrines are being connected. This fact that they're denying that Jesus came in the flesh is somehow leading to a de-emphasis on love. And that leads us then to the purpose for John writing this short letter. A brief note, really. Verse 8, watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, by which, of course, he doesn't mean the false teaching, he means the true teaching, the original, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. So that's what this letter is really all about. It's a warning. I will say, just as an aside, the epistle, of 2 John is not written to combat the doctrine of once saved, always saved. But what do you think verse 8 does to a doctrine like that? It condemns it, doesn't it? Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for. Whoever leaves the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides, whoever stays in the teaching, has the Father and the Son. Keep this passage in mind in case you come into contact with some of that stuff. Well, finally then in 2 John, John says in verse 10, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. So we need to kind of start with a big picture question. If you provide for a person who is teaching this false doctrine that John is condemning, if you greet the person as welcome and you receive them into your house, you're assisting them. You're having fellowship with them and the evil teaching that they bring along. But also to put this in a historical context, because we need to read these two phrases of receiving them into your house and offering them a greeting as John's audience would, and not so much the same way that we would. In John's day, they didn't really have too many hotels all around. At least not many that were very much better than a brothel or a tavern. And so if people in the first century world were going to travel from one location to another, they typically would try to find lodgings with acquaintances or other people's homes. There were, of course, some inns in their world. We read about a few of them, but most of them just weren't the kind of place that you'd want to frequent, if you could even afford to. So you depended on the hospitality of those you traveled to see or to do business with. And so these people are coming in, these false teachers are, and they're claiming to be Christians, and they're wanting to teach their new gospel, and they want to stay in the homes of the Christians who are there. And if you receive them into your house, and you provide somebody with a mission like that, with lodging, when they come to your town to teach their lies, then you are participating and sharing with them in their evil deeds. Does that make sense? I'll add to this also, I don't know if this is what's going on here, but it's at least a reasonable and thought-provoking suggestion. In the New Testament, nearly every church met in somebody's home. They didn't have the money to go off and construct a location specifically for the purpose of meeting together. There may be a couple of instances where they were able to do something else, but nearly every church met in the home of somebody that was the members there. What did we see in the letter to Philemon? The church met in his home. So if your congregation typically meets in somebody's house, it's possible that when John says, do not receive him into your house, that he means you, the elect lady and her children, you, the congregation to which I'm reading or writing, do not receive these people into your assemblies. Do not welcome them as brothers. I don't know if that's what's going on, but that's a possible way of understanding this. Either way, these are false teachers who are seeking a platform to spread their false doctrine, and John says, don't let them do it for a minute. Well, finally, then, John says, though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face so that our joy may be complete. And as I said, so much of this just sounds like something that Paul would write too. There's even more I'd like to write about to you, but I'd rather say those things to you face to face. And when we do get to see each other, it will complete my joy. Well, that leaves us 4 minutes, I think, to look at 3 John, which has a number of similarities to 2 John and indeed to Philemon. Turn over there with me very quickly. I'm going to read it just for the sake of time. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul. For I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Beloved, it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers, and also stops those who want to, and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We add also our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. And then you might recognize this greeting. I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, each by name. So John the Elder, he addresses this third letter to a man named Gaius. You may remember that we read about a few men named Gaius throughout the New Testament. It's possible that there are 4 different men that carry that name. That name in Rome was just about as common as John is in our country. So we have absolutely no idea if any of them are the same individual. There are 2 that are known for their hospitality, as this one is here, but to link any of them definitively is just impossible. I imagine also that after our study of the very heartfelt epistle to Philemon from the Apostle Paul, you may feel like you're on familiar ground with this tender opening that you have in 3 John. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth, beloved, I pray that all may go well with you, that you may be in good health. I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. And then this, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. And there at the end there, when he says that, he's obviously including Gaius in the description, my children. Well, Paul referred to those that he converted as his children in the Lord. We saw that with Philemon. And John seems to be doing the very same thing here, indicating that he's responsible for bringing Gaius to the Lord, and it thrills him to hear of the Christ-like faith he possesses. He says, beloved, it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testify to your love before the church. So John's crossed paths with some of these teachers of the gospel that Gaius has helped. And they could only say good things about him because of his godly hospitality. And in fact, the verb that's used there seems to indicate that it's not just one group, it's group after group. And that may be the case that perhaps many people have spoken to John about the kind of charity of this brother in Christ. He says, you'll do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they've gone out for the sake of the name of Christ, the name of God, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. So they're not taking the support that they're due for the labor of the Lord from their Gentile audiences, which may remind you of Paul's decision not to take money at times from those he was preaching to in order to avoid any misunderstanding as to his motives in teaching the gospel. And perhaps these teachers, whoever they were of the same mind and facing some of the same potential misunderstandings. So John commends Gaius for making up what was lacking in their aid. He says we ought to support people like these. And then he calls them he says that we may be fellow workers for the truth. That phrase seems to catch on. So Paul is thrilled about how Gaius is doing, but he's got this warning about this man named Demetrius. Gaius is exceedingly godly, offering hospitality and lodging and assistance to the very kind of true brethren that we should help. But there's one who is actively doing the opposite to make sure that the church he worships with has nothing to do with these true teachers that John has sent. And he even seems to wield so much power and influence over the church there that if someone does help the true teachers of the gospel, he gets them booted out. Now, it's impossible to determine exactly how all of these men and even the previous epistle tie together, if they do at all. It's possible that all of this comes together very cleanly, that Diotrephes and Gaius both are members of the same church, and that's the church that's addressed in 2 John. And Diotrephes is trying to suppress what John wrote their church, and John is writing Gaius privately to urge him to help in the matter. But no one has any idea. That's a possible construction of events, but there's absolutely no way to confirm it. We don't know where the congregation of 2 John is located. We don't know where Gaius attends or where Diotrephes attends, or for that matter, if they even worship in the same place. But Gaius shows the kind of godly hospitality that John has emphasized in 1 and 2 John, and Diotrephes seeks to serve himself and rejects the authority of John. Very quickly, you've got the last 3 verses. That second to last thought is almost identical to the second to last thought of 2 John. I had much to write you, but I'd rather not use pen and ink. I want to see you face to face. But then my favorite part of this entire epistle comes at the end. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. greet the friends, each by name. And that final greeting is just unique. And certainly not for the love that it displays. You've got final greetings all throughout the New Testament that are usually filled with making sure that different individuals, usually mentioned by name, are greeted and wished well in the Lord. But here, instead of the church or the brethren or so-and-so greets you, or even the children of your elect sister greet you, we have this unique and just thoroughly warm term, the friends. I think 3 John is in every way as warm and heartfelt an epistle as we found Philemon to be. And I just absolutely love that ending, to think of my brothers and sisters in Christ as the friends. It's just a tremendous way to end that epistle. All right, thank you for a couple of extra minutes. We'll finish our VBS with Jude in the next hour, and we'll try to start somewhere around 35 after.